Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you again today. Very excited again to be with my comrade, Lara Sheehi. I'll say comrade a few times. That'll piss the Zionists off. Uh, as we do another edition of our series on decolonial psychoanalysis, Palestine, settler colonialism, and so on, right? Um, Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, support on Patreon if you are able to. Um, Needing this convo this morning. I think a lot of us are needing this convo. It has been too long since we've done one of these, and there are reasons for that. We have to travel across continents and things like that. Um, well, not me. Uh, but anyway, very good to be with you all again. And yeah, let me just say quickly for folks who don't know, Lara Sheehi is an assistant professor of clinical psychology at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. She is the co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, and is working on a new book, From the Clinic to the Street, Psychoanalysis for Revolutionary Futures, which will be out next year on Pluto Press. And if you don't know, we have a whole playlist of these conversations that we've been doing um, since November, late October. Um, and uh, and so anyways, that's enough to say up front. Lara, welcome. It's good to be with you again.
Hey Jay, so good to see you, comrade. I'll say it too to piss them off. Also, I'm super excited to be sandwiched in with this lineup you have this week. I mean, I've been listening and catching up. So, folks, if you haven't had the chance, they've been awesome. And tomorrow's episode also looks great.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's so much going on, and I I am no longer working. For the last 6 months. I've been working on Fridays and Saturdays at Making Worlds in Philadelphia. I'm not working there anymore, which is primarily just due to uh, school's back in session. It's helpful for me to be able to pick up my kids on Fridays, and also giving up Fridays and Saturdays on a weekly basis as a parent is challenging. And so there are a lot of things I will miss about that, but also it does open up space to have conversations on Fridays and Saturdays too. So I'm excited about that, which obviously this is Friday one tomorrow with Kalia Kuno, which is rescheduled. We had originally intended to do it a couple weeks ago, and one of his kids got COVID. And so that was the reason that it got delayed. But really excited to have that discussion tomorrow, which for folks who don't know, basically we're discussing a piece that he and some other folks wrote a couple of years ago, but essentially it's like fascism is here, fascism is going to continue to be here, and it's going to get more fascist, and that thinking that we can vote for one party or another within the United States as some kind of bulwark or defense against this is misguided analysis, essentially, because and Kali will say this more eloquently than I, but I think his analysis is that it's basically a structural necessity within capitalism at this point that we have all of the things that we might think of as fascistic, whether that's harsher borders, more policing, more incarceration, just to even be able to deal with the contradictions of climate change, which capitalism has produced, imperialism and migrations that come from this, and migrations obviously also come from climate change. All of these things, right, are necessitating that they have to basically engage in genocide on one hand, and in population control, and all of these things. And also I think a part of it, which would be interesting to talk to him about too, is I think that the investment of capitalism via imperialism, but also through like what we think of as the military industrial complex and these weapons companies and things like that, mean that in order for the system to continue to function that wars must sort of be a constant feature of it as well, right? And
And have the most lethal military in the world.
right. And so the point that Kali takes up is like, okay, so then what do we do, right? How do we then organize ourselves differently than thinking about what has long been a kind of strategy that we see trotted out every 4 years, which is like, well, vote for the Democrats because it's going to be not as bad. It's a lesser evil, right? And so this is like goes back to a kind of popular front, strategy of defeating fascism, but it doesn't work. So, anyways, we'll talk about that, and talk about what the thing I love about Kali is that he like is all for proposing like concrete actions and alternatives that people can take as opposed to just the criticism, which I think the criticism is important as well. But I think that, people then need stuff that they can do. And so, yeah. But yeah, great conversations this week. I know we'll talk a little bit about probably both of them, but really enjoyed talking with the Good Shepherd Collective on Wednesday. I love those folks. And also with Kaleem and Janine from Palestinian Youth Movement yesterday. And there's a few things that I want to bring up from that discussion in particular today. So topic today was love and hate. We went back and forth on it. At one point I had hate and evil. But
and I said I don't really use that word.
yeah, and we could talk about that too a little bit. But I think that there's some stuff I'll pull up to talk about this a little bit. But one thing that maybe we could start with is people probably saw. I don't think I'm gonna play it, but there was a clip from what is it called? Two good Jewish boys, something like this. So this is this Israeli podcast. Somebody did a thread on it, and it's important to note that this is not like a fringe. It's not. I mean, obviously, there's a little bit of edgelord stuff going on, which we're used to in the United States from certain podcasters too. But these people have done campaigning and messaging with Netanyahu. They're like very, involved in kind of everyday Israeli mainstream political discourse, I guess you could say, in some ways, right? And I don't know what the equivalent would be, whether it would be like Joe Rogan or something like that in our context, right? But they had this clip where they, are talking about basically that if every Israeli could had the option that they could push a button that would erase all Palestinians. And they start within Gaza, but then the other co-host says in the West Bank too, that they would do it, right? And that they wouldn't think too much about it, is what they said. And they said that also that they might not say it, they might be hiding in their closet doing it or whatever, but that they would all do it. And I mean, for one, it brought up some of Mary Turfa's interventions. I think also of that she wrote a great piece, Running Amok. Of how are we thinking about how do we resist pathologizing, right, when something seems to us so pathological. And I think one of the things that's important is to have also like some materialist and structural analysis and sort of think about what is this sentiment built off of, right? And then we can point to settler colonialism, we can point to the kind of role that the Zionist entity has had as a kind of attack dog of Western imperialism within the Middle East, and of the fact that as a settler colony that it is based upon the elimination of Palestinians also, right? And so in some sense, this kind of makes perfect sense. But anyways, why don't we start with that? And I don't know what you want to say in response to that, but I would love to hear your thoughts and then we can go into some more stuff.
You can imagine I have a lot of thoughts about it. Well, it's interesting because I think you know the sort of segue into how do we not pathologize? And I think there's something really important here to sort of focus on. When the sort of smear campaign about me started, one of the main talking points that fascists, right-wing ideologues, and so-called liberal Zionists and their liberal counterparts in the settler colony of the United States took up was a clip from Stephen and myself doing a podcast very early on when our book was first released. And they ran with this idea that I said all Zionists are psychotic, right? Number one, I did not say that. I'm not so sloppy, right, to be saying things like that, nor do I believe in sort of a mass diagnosis of a people, not because I'm not looking at the atrocities that they're committing or seeing clips like this on a regular, by the way, of just casual racism and casual dehumanization, but because pathologizing a people usually doesn't work in favor of pathologizing the powerful. To the contrary, it's actually turned against us. We see this in the context of the United States and the quote unquote war on terror and the Arab mind and all these sorts of things. And so I'm very circumspect in terms of using psychology like that, partially because, again, it's a sort of shorthand that really doesn't say anything to what you're saying. What is the structural reading of this? What's the condition we're actually looking at? What are the things that actually make this possible? And for me, most importantly, ideologically, what's actually happening? I think it's a deflection to go in that direction. So I say this because I think it's interesting that that's the piece, right? That becomes the salacious piece, that I said this. And first of all, psychoanalytically, the concept of psychotic process is very built into the actual theory itself. It is not a controversy to say that somebody might engage in a psychotic process. A very good example of that is in the context of the settler colony of the United States. We can walk around and on a daily basis, we don't admit, and sometimes we completely forget that we're on stolen land. That is a psychotic process because it necessitates you disavowing and excising a part of reality over and over and over again. So it's a reality bending, what Stephen and I call it in the book, settler colonial reality bending. So that's not even controversial. But if we're to sort of move to this clip here, and this is a sort of current instantiation of this, and actually very important for us to look at. You and I have talked a lot about in this series and in conversations offline too, about militant clarity. And it's these sort of clips that sort of wrench us back into what is it that we're actually looking at? What is the condition here? And why can we see the genocide and the annexation that is currently being, right, trying to have a full annexation of Palestine in general? Why can that happen? Because I think, if we listen to what they said in this podcast, it's an unvarnished honesty. And there's all these ways in which we are enticed and seduced into justifying away language that is very clear. Fascists are very clear about their language, right? And there's all these sort of mental gymnastics that liberals do, that liberal Zionists, of course, do. And then there's this way in which clips like this are actually incredibly important for us and very clarifying. Not because they're any less terrifying in terms of, like you said, this is mainstream. This is not a fringe movement, but also to remind us that all of these sort of talking points about a Netanyahu government, or that taking him out of government, and everybody listening here knows this, but these talking points take up so much time, and we end up arguing with those rather than saying, the fact that somebody would be saying this is actually unvarnished truth and honesty, because this is Zionism, right? It's constitutively supremacist in its nature. It relies, like you said, on the subjugation of an indigenous people and an insistence, like Patrick Wolf teaches us, that it's the settler that's the native, and it's the native that is somehow making it like so inconvenient that you can't fulfill the full fantasies of your settlement and subjugation. These darn fucking Palestinians just won't go away. There's no other way to do it than for us to fantasize about one fell swoop button that will erase everybody. And it's not enough to just say Gaza, right? Now we're at a point where it's just like, okay, Zionists are all about the full and utter destruction of Gaza, as they have been for a long time. But there's a reminder here. It says, no, that's not what we're just talking about. So again, here, like you and I have also talked about psychic inversions. The slogan from the river to the sea is psychically inverted to be that is the genocidal call, rather than the honest admission that they are not just talking about Gaza, they are talking about from the river to the sea. That is precisely why it's important for us to continue to use that slogan, to be serious and specific about what we mean by that, because, again, not because as an errant sort of, accidental unfolding that became, actualized in this fascist government that we're seeing now, but precisely because at its inception, Zionism is a settler colonial ideology that is intent to harm, its intent to erase, its intent to show its might and its power by fully erasing indigenous people, and that's Palestinians. And so there's a way in which clips like this actually are incredibly validating for us. We can feel enraged, and we should, right? And we're going to go into the question of hate and how useful it might be, psychically useful. But we can't just stop there, right? We can't stop at the surface and be like, then saying, look how psychotic it is. And I'm not saying that people don't use those words. I'm not shaming anybody for using that, but it is a practice for us, just like practicing this discourse, to go back to the condition that we make it possible for somebody to be so honest in their position. And that's actually an important piece for us, because that is precisely what has happened over the last 11 months. When you say Gaza changed the world, there are no, mistakes here. We see exactly the position that people have. We know Zionism is precisely for what it is and what for Palestinians have been telling us since before 1948. And there's no mistake about it. So that if people now are still, pearl clutching or going back and forth, I now know precisely what you are. You are a Zionist sympathizer or a Zionist, and you're pro-genocide. These are very important, actually, positions for us to kind of clarify our position and keep coming back to it over and over again.
Yeah, right on. I appreciate that. I think I know so we want to talk about hate a little bit. And so in kind of thinking about this, I've been thinking about this. And again, like folks could probably gather why evil was on my mind after watching a clip like that if they saw it, right? But I think that the part about it, right, that I want to talk about too, and I'm gonna share some from a book by China Mieville, because China Mieville wrote a book called The Spectre Haunting, which is kind of it's really him thinking with the Communist Manifesto. And he's I don't agree with, I always feel weird saying this because I don't agree with anybody on everything, but I don't agree with China on like all things politically, but I find him a very interesting thinker. And I find him somebody that I really, when he writes stuff, he's a very good writer. First of all, I mean, he's an award-winning writer. But it's very generative, right? And I know that's a term that people use a lot, nowadays, but I think very much so in his case, where like you read his work and it really, you think a lot about the kind of ideas that he's working with. And so whenever I think about hate, there's kind of two people that I think about. One is Dylan Rodriguez and the other is China. And China, so Dylan, we had a conversation with about his book, the one about multiracial white supremacy. I'm forgetting what it's called right now. But this was a few years ago on the audio side of millennials. And, in that conversation, one of the things we just asked him about, because we were having kind of some general abolition discussion within it. And this idea of people wanting to prosecute cops, right? And this is something that certain abolitionists have an issue with. And part of it has to do with the fact that prosecuting a police officer is in certain ways a legitimation of the system of justice that produces the police officer, right? And so it's like you are fixing the problem, quote unquote, right, by individualizing the
Mm-hmm.
problem,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, this is not like my take on it is like anybody who has been in police brutality or has had the like I don't care, like sue the shit out of them, like prosecute, like I have moved way past beyond like trying to have some debate with people about like how they should or should not engage
Mm-hmm.
uh the criminal justice system vis-a-vis like police violence. Like to me, that's just not a debate that I'm interested in having, and there's perfectly good reasons why people want to do it. um Even if often they have a critique of the system as a whole, right? And I think about Alejandro Villalpando talking about his work with families around this, and a lot of the politicization that they go through with them through that process sometimes of suing, and trying to get people, so anyways, leaving that aside, like what we talked about was the revenge impulse with
Mm-hmm.
Dylan, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that he wanted, rather than to see it individualized, it to be socialized, right? Or it to be that it's not wrong of people to want justice and to want retribution even from these very violent structures, um but that you have to broaden it out beyond just looking at the individual person, right, to understand what are the material conditions in which this person can do this thing, and which they have impunity to do this thing, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a very interesting point. And what's similar in China's thing about hate, Dylan also talks about hate, because the important thing about hate is that this is something that's used by liberals all the time, right?
Yep.
We're against hate, right? And
Yes.
so he actually talks about how this is a key aspect of a lot of these kind of liberal large NGO, basically often counterinsurgent formations that are just sort of against hate, and they often use it as we could talk about Southern Poverty Law Center, right, to go after both far right forces, right, who obviously are racist and organize around, their hatred of certain groups of people, but also will use it to go after anti-colonial or like black nationalist or oppressed
Mm-hmm.
groups, right, that
Mm-hmm.
have like a hatred of white
Mm-hmm.
supremacy, say,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that these things become equivalent, right,
Mm-hmm.
within this sort of nonprofit anti-hate world, right? He's talked about it a lot within the Stop Asian
Stop
Hate
Asian hate.
movement in
Yeah, I love
particular.
that podcast was awesome.
Yeah. So anyway, we're gonna move to China. So I'm gonna actually read a little bit of a passage from his book. I'm gonna kind of skim it and read parts of it here. Um, so he starts this like talking about Trump um, in 1989, which, talking about the Central Park Five, suggested that maybe hate is what we need if we're going to get something done. His hatred was then and remains a vicious deployment of racist class spite, a demand for the judicial murder of the Central Park Five, five black teenagers falsely accused of rape. The concrete content of this hate is everything against which we should stand, but how best to counter hate? Is such hate as this itself not worthy of hatred? Um, he goes on to talk about Trump's sort of shrewdness. He talks about this philosopher and Anglican priest, Stephen Shakespeare. I did want to say that because I don't want people to confuse that it's William. That warns that a focus on hate as anything other than a force to be rejected is fraught and dangerous territory, which I agree with, by the way. And he kind of gets into that too. How could it be otherwise? Hatred, after all, is an emotion that can short circuit thought and analysis, can segue into violence, and not necessarily with any discrimination. Um, so let's see, moving on a little bit. So yeah, talking about Shakespeare then attempts exactly to focus, which he warns, precisely to be more discriminatory about hate when it comes, where it comes from, where it should be directed, and how it gets captured for the purposes of others. I think that's important. And a key point he makes is that hatred, which assumes no founding truth or harmony, but knows itself to be against the dominating other, is a constituent part of the singularity of every created being, right? So the claim then in the face of human history is that hatred, particularly by the oppressed, is inevitable. This isn't to say that it's inevitable that all people, even oppressed people, will experience hate. It's to claim that hate being neither contingent nor alien to the human soul, some, likely many, will. That, particularly in the context of societies that pit people against each other individually and en masse, hate will certainly exist. People will hate, as many of us know personally, right? So he goes on, drop down here a little bit. Marx had a famous maxim that's pertinent here, which translates to "nothing human is alien to me," right? Meaning that if it comes from humanity, we have to understand it, right? It's certainly productive. Sorry, it's hardly productive to pathologize hate per se, not least when it's natural that it arises, let alone to make it cause for shame. Sophie Lewis adds, hate is almost never talked about as appropriate, healthy, or necessary in liberal democratic society. For conservatives, liberals, and socialists alike, hate itself is something to reject, uproot, defeat, and cast out of the soul. Yet anti-hate ideology doesn't seem to involve targeting its root causes and points of production, nor does it address the inevitability of, or the demand, the need for hate in a class society. Right? Very important point. To raise this issue not only of the existence of hatred, but for some at least, of its potentially rigorous necessity, is, to put it in Kenneth Surin's terms, what lies behind, quote, deploying a deliberate hate as a rational category. All right. Hate should never be trusted, nor treated as safe, nor celebrated for its own sake, but inevitable, it should not be ignored, nor is it automatically undeserved. Perhaps can we do without it? Not if we are to remain human. In a hateful epoch that pathologizes radical hate and encourages outrage fatigue. So then, let's see. And nor is careful hate necessarily an enemy of liberation. It might be an ally, right? He goes on to talk about this pre-Marxist socialist, Auguste Blanqui. His acolytes swore an oath, in the name of the Republic, I swear eternal hatred to all kings, aristocrats, and all oppressors of humanity. Then let's see, Francis Adams, a radical Australian poet, wrote he had destroyed his health in pursuit of working class struggle in London. It seemed a failure, he wrote, but I never despaired or saw cause to despair. There was a splendid foundation of hate there. With hate, all things are possible. He then talks about Dorothy Counts, who desegregated a school in North Carolina. Writing of the photograph of her walking past vicious, jeering mob of demonstrators, James Baldwin wrote, "It made me furious. It filled me with both hatred and pity. The latter for Counts, that's pity. The former for what he saw in the faces of her attackers. It would be an astonishingly and priggish," I love Mielville's vocabulary. I don't even know what that means. Piety to suggest that hatred such as this was unbecoming, or that it did not work for emancipation. Crucially, as Francis Adams wrote, all things are possible with hate, not only good things. That's the danger. But some good things, surely, in terms of example of activist vigor. Raging too, certainly, but raging against something, wishing its eradication. The very absence of a critical mass of hatred may militate against resistance. Goes to Walter Benjamin, talking about how social democracy, as opposed to militant socialism, He took it to task for its focus on the future and on the working class as redeemer, thus actively weakening that class by directing its eyes away from the iniquities of the past and present, to, quote, forget both its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice. It was in part this hatred that he thought there might be strength. So I'm wrapping up here now, folks. I'm going to finish up this part and then we can get into it. But and hate may not help may help not only with strength, but with intellectual rigor and of analysis too. The very flat abstractions of capital can generate their own seemingly implacable logic against which an emotionally invested, a hating contrary eye might prove necessary not only ethically, but epistemologically. Quote, what will never function is the cold logic of reason, Mario Tronti writes, quote, when it is not moved by class hatred, end quote, because knowledge is connected to the struggle. Whoever has true hatred has truly understood. Tronti goes so far as to describe a radical antinomianism, that is opposition to, quote, the entire world of bourgeois society, as well as deadly class hatred against it, as, quote, the simplest form of Marx's working class science, right? And so then I'm just going to move down to the bottom. Class hatred, hatred by a social force, of an opposing social force, of that dominating other Stephen Shakespeare identifies. Such hate is just, indicated, and necessary. Quote, not a personal, psychological, or pathological hate, but a radical structural hate for what the world has become, end quote. And yeah, I mean, I really, this whole passage resonated with me when I read it before, but I came back to it because of this, because like I get so angry and I get so filled with rage. I think the thing that did it recently for me, and I don't know why, was there was a photo of like an 80-year-old Palestinian man who was like just surrounded by cats, and people were like, he's the old guy in our neighborhood that is like the cat guy, and Israel, killed him in a drone strike the other day, and it's like I just lost it. And it's like, it's such a, like, I mean, like, there's so many reasons to lose it every day, but for some reason it was such a perfect example of like the absurdity of the kind of genocidal violence, right? That they would specifically target, and because we know of the level of precision that they have, he was specifically targeted, right?
Yes.
And so, yeah. So anyways, I'll just leave it there for now. You can take it away. I've said a lot and I've read a lot. So, and then I'm sure I'll have thoughts on what you say too.
This is the best part of us having these conversations, because it's like, it generates something, and then we're like, we need to organize this, and why the fuck am I feeling this way, and what is it, this particular thing that triggered? Like you said, I think that the sort of baseline is being enraged and horrified and constantly plugged in to the atrocities that are happening. And I think we've talked about this before, about actually the importance of having affect in the middle of that. And so why wouldn't hate be involved in that too? But I think this is to sort of like unwind this question. And I love that you found this. So when you send it to me, I was just like, this is perfect, right? Because it's such a perfect encapsulation of what we're talking about. And again, there's this way in which when we say bring the affect into the room, there's also a way that we have to sort of recognize that by and large, affect and being in general is disciplined, is heavily disciplined. And so, feeling spaces and all these sorts of things as also marked by a neoliberal sort of push within the university around processing spaces and DEI initiatives around this. The unspoken part of that is that there's still a disciplinary tactic about what affect is allowed and what's not, right? Like you still have to perform the affect and the sort of part of being in a very neat and non-messy way. Otherwise, you are disciplined for it. And I think this is where hate does fit into that, and why we see such rhetoric, which, by the way, is coercive affective rhetoric. This is not innocent rhetoric that disciplines you. Anytime you feel hate, there's a response of like, whether it's a campaign based on joy, that as you're, you know, enacting a fucking genocide, which again, the ability to even articulate that with such arrogance and audacity is something unto itself, right? But then also a sort of social disciplinary process that shores up a social order. We can't have people understanding that actually it is the biggest form of class warfare to swear an oath to hate kings, right? The bourgeoisie, the sort of national bourgeoisie, and everything that stands for that, like that. So there's a process that is both state-sponsored and institution, nonpartisan, all these sorts of things to corral affect and say there's a piece of this that's okay and there's a piece of this that's not. Sometimes it's very outright spoken, like there is no, we have a zero tolerance policy towards this affect, right? Even as the action itself is incredibly violent. Your zero tolerance policy is incredibly violent and enacts all the things that you're saying around like why you don't, you know, endorse this in any sort of way. But that itself, I think, tells us something. There's something really important here. And maybe this is also a good reason why I move away from using evil towards hate, because I think there's something very important psychically as a psychodynamic process that is not stagnant when we talk about issues of hate. And I think this thing that you're reading for us precisely lays that out, that there are different mechanisms through which it's understood. There's different targets on which it's affected, let's say. There are issues of power that are involved. There are issues of who feels the hate, what the roots of that is, towards whom, and structurally, whether it's supported or not, right? Or completely suppressed. I find that to be actually a far more enticing conversation that I think speaks and does justice to what you felt when you saw that piece. And let me get a little bit, I don't mean to be pedantic about this, but when we talk about, I think you know me now well enough to know, like, the words that we're using have associative processes, and they actually mean something in terms of the material impact in which, or the sort of world in which they're deployed, and they're corralled by state forces and by institutional forces, again, towards disciplinary aims. So, for example, when we use the word evil, there's also a way in which we think about this, particularly in the context of religion, that evil can be exercised or redeemed. That's not to say that we are not seeing acts of evil. I was saying the other day to Stephen that every atrocity that we can think of historically in the world, and sort of think about all the things that we learned about what was enacted on a people and had to have them endure. We have seen every single one of those historical examples consolidated in Gaza. Mass starvation, concentration camps, beheadings, executions, the wholesale murder of entire generations and families, the targeting of children, manufactured diseases to kill people. I mean, everything we could think of, if you consolidate all of that and coalesce it and say everything we can think of in history can be seen in Gaza. So I'm not saying there isn't like the act of that, but I really want us to move away from this idea that we can redeem Zionism, which is why I'm not using the term evil, right? Because Zionism needs to be abolished and it needs to be divested from. And that process is an active process that needs to be done by actual people. It's a daily commitment to divest from the structure and the ideology that would have it be that these acts can happen in the name of that ideology, right? And to then harness a sort of universal liberal humanist discourse around the worst possible thing we could do is hate. Forget targeting life-making efforts. And maybe that's part of what was so enraging about this piece. And maybe this is me just sort of connecting to what I feel in, is when we see people who are enacting humanity and creating life and sustaining life under conditions that we couldn't even imagine life can continue, like feeding cats or planting. We know that there is also a targeted assassination of the young man who did I'm forgetting his name now off the top of my head, and I'm really so sorry for that. So if we can find his name, I would love to speak his name. Content creator who planted things, right, and showed us every single day what gardening looks like and planting things in the earth. That these are the people that are targeted are also, I think, part of the reason why we react in this way, is that there is a targeted attempt to snuff out life, and any attempt to create life and subsist despite that, right? Despite the conditions. Did you find his name, Jared?
Yes. I think it is. So wait, hang on. Yeah, this is it, I believe.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lurkin. So it's Mido Halimi. So I think that's part of it. And so for me, when we say that, right, there's a commitment to sort of divesting from the processes that would make that happen. And then there's a going into this idea of, I think what you were sort of fleshing out for us is there a psychic benefit to feeling hate, right? One of the links that I sent you was an Erich Fromm article from 1942 called "Should We Hate Hitler?" Right? Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst, I should say. He's deceased. A leftist, an avowed leftist, wrote about fascism, and spent most of his life thinking through these things. Of course, came to the United States and then taught at Columbia, I believe. But he's, I say he's a darling of the left because he's a darling currently of so-called leftist psychoanalysts who, you might not be surprised, are pro-genocide currently, right? But I think part of what he lays out here is that there are perhaps roots or places from which hate emanates that actually is really important for us to distinguish and discern, similar to the place that you were, the piece that you were reading for us, and sort of the discipline that it takes in us to not collapse into the sort of moralizing and the fear mongering that gets implanted in us, that interjects within us about fearing when we feel hate. And he's saying, actually, there's a distinction between these things, and we need to be able to have the stamina to look at this, to not fall into the trap that you were talking about an equivalence, a sort of moral equivalence that ends up being the same as like horseshoe theory, like, oh, it's the same sort of forces. And I think the thing that really struck me was, again, this is in 1942 within psychoanalysis, right? Saying that there's something really important about a hate that is sort of generated, and this is a sort of parallel to what you were reading for us, a hate that is generated from the love of all things and from the love for the world that we are building together and that we believe can come into being, versus a hate that is constant, that will be present no matter what, and that is insistent on destruction. And that's fascism, right? It's not like fascists are sort of responding to a certain condition. There's a way in which a perpetual sort of cyclone of hate is central. This is why he leads with Trump, right? Saying we need hate to get things done. It's like, yeah, the Nazis fucking said that too, right? And that's the sort of basis of it, rather than what does it mean for us to push up against the coercive affective identifications with purity, with kindness, with niceness, with complete and utter discipline, where again, the worst thing we could possibly imagine is us hating the forces structurally that actually cause oppression and destruction and subjugation and domination and exploitation, right? That we keep militant clarity about those things structurally actually allows us to de-individualize hate, right? And to continuously be checking in so that it doesn't become co-opted by a sort of, purely destructive or nihilist. I think this is what I'm trying to say. It's not a nihilist hate. It's one that is pointed and understands the conditions that we were pushing up against and actually fuels what is necessary for us. To think that we can sustain a struggle that will bring in the world that is free of exploitation and domination that we want to live in without experiencing any hate is one of the ways in which we can pursue or subsist on this very cardboard-esque idea about our internal worlds, or the things we need to reckon with, or the seams we have to push up against, and the commitment, like I said, it's a commitment every single day for us to say to ourselves, am I focused on the condition that I want to abolish? Or am I being enticed by one way or another into a distraction, a moralization, a deflection, right? Because the deflection of like, when we start defending, of course I hate this, and we start like, you've already lost. The contours of this argument are already set such that what you are allowed to direct anger, be irate about, is already set for you. And everything else outside, I think I saw this thing like everything outside of dying becomes, impolite to do. And that's, I think, goes back to the disciplinary tactics of it, like the retaining and reproduction of social order through these sorts of mechanisms, which include the psychic and the affective.
Yeah, I'm thinking even too, like, so thinking about, I'm just going to call it like the hate industrial complex, even though it's not a thing, but maybe. But like one of the tools, right, against discrimination in the United States, a legal tool against it, has been like the Civil Rights Act, the creation of protected classes, right? And like I think about the ways that this has been distorted in recent years, in very fascistic ways. I mean, one of them is individual states, and even to some degree, mostly at an individual state level, but there are states who basically want to they like blur the lines of like hate crime legislation, which is a problem in itself, and we could talk about that a little bit, again, to the sort of the people who usually end up getting most severely punished against it are the people that are the most marginalized, right?
Yeah.
But the the point being like that police, right, in certain categories, right, have become basically a protected class. I mean, they already operate with impunity, right? But like if somebody does something that's could be gauged as a hate crime, right, against the police, right? So there's that. There's also NYU's new policy, which includes Zionism as a protected class, right? Saying that it's a basically a code word, right, that people are using so that they can say anti-Semitic things, right? And they're using Zionist as a code word, right? rather than like, no, like this is an ideology. It's actually, it has a material structure, right, in the state of Israel, and so on. So there's that. I did
Mhm.
want to bring up, because you made me think about it as you were talking. Joy James is the one who first kind of brought this passage to my attention in one of our conversations. But it's just like the beginning of Soledad Brother, and George Jackson says, "To the man child, tall, evil, graceful, bright-eyed black man child, Jonathan Peter Jackson, who died on August 7th, 1907, courage in one hand, assault rifle in the other, my brother, comrade, friend, a true revolutionary, the black communist guerrilla in the highest stage of development. He died on the trigger, scourge of the unrighteous, soldier of the people. To this terrible man child and his wonderful mother, Georgia B., to Angela Y. Davis, my tender experience, I dedicate this collection of letters. To the destruction of their enemies, I dedicate my life."
Mhm.
And,
Mhm.
you know,
Mhm.
Joy, Dr. James uses it to, uh, just talk about that, you know, folks can go listen to it. It's the first conversation that we had with her on Millennials a few years ago. But she was just like, I will take that militant clarity,
Yes.
and even if it makes us uncomfortable,
Mhm.
right? Even if I might, want to clutch my pearls, right, at some of the ways that it is framed, right, over something that is nice,
Yeah.
right, but it's not, that doesn't is not going to cut it, right.
Yeah.
And I think about like Yemen, right? I think about like the kind of, there's all this hand wringing that happens around the Yemeni people, and like, oh, their slogan is bad, right? We don't, and it's like, this is a whole, you see like hundreds of thousands of people who are like, we are
Mhm.
dedicated to the liberation of Palestinians,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Do I am I going to be like, do I care that, like, I don't care on it. Like, I'm just be honest for myself.
Yes.
I don't
Yes.
care
Yes.
about how they might phrase certain things in ways that make people uncomfortable, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I will
Mhm.
take the discipline, the courage, I mean, we're talking about people who have, by the way, been living within genocidal conditions for over a decade
Yep.
themselves,
Yep.
right? Um, you know, and there's something I'll talk about a little bit more when we get to GoFundMe's later on, but like, recently I've had Yemenis asking me to share some of their GoFundMe's, and I'm happy to do so, and so, yeah, I mean, it's like, anyway, I just wanted to say that. If you have more that you want to
Yes.
say in response to that, I can move on to another thing though, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I no, I what not know. Yes, I do have something to say about the like getting stuck. Like part of it is asking ourselves, like, why do people get stuck on these things? What is it about that? And maybe part of, one of the things I have loved about these conversations that you and I have is what does it mean for us to sort of unpack the mechanics? And in my sort of the way that I might frame it for myself is a despecialization of psychoanalytic principles or expertise or thinking, much like Che Guevara did in the field about like these this knowledge base from which we draw is not ours to hoard. And what does it mean when you spend a lot of fucking time thinking about this shit, and then you can sort of, in conversation with comrades, distill this in a particular way? Not that it's the, ultimate truth, but one way in which we are thinking through this together to produce something else, right? And I think this is the thing, when you say, like, what is it about people getting stuck on these things, might come back to what you and I have talked about many times about this internalization of these values that kind of pop up out of nowhere, this imperialist, settler, colonial, universal, liberalist, values that some of us might think we've done away with or divested from. And then they rear their ugly head in these sorts of ways that end up getting, you know, manifested in things like, I don't like this slogan, it's too aggressive, right? And it's for us in that moment to halt and really question and disrupt what are the sort of, again, civilizing discourses that come to live inside us that animate that in a particular way against the backdrop of what we are seeing. What could possibly be worse or more aggressive than what we saw happen in Yemen, funded by Saudi Arabia and the United States, right? And what we are now seeing unfold in Gaza. What could possibly, so it starts to sound silly when we say that, and more than silly, it gives away that there's something else there. And that's our clue. That's our clue. What I would sort of implore people to do is, that's a clue. It's not to shame. It's to say there's a clue something else is working on you. And if we are serious about the work of divesting from imperialist ways of being and doing, and insisting that everybody else does, you've said this before in our conversations, like that's such a jingoistic sort of American-centric way of thinking about things, then we have to be serious about the method and process of interrogating these things within ourselves. And that sort of example is a place to do that. Because what you're saying is that, of course, it elevates the individual as the primary focus. And most importantly, it reconfigures the political terrain. You are not engaging in an innocent act when you start to say that these slogans are too aggressive or these sorts of things. Is you're actually endorsing a reconfiguration of the political terrain, and you're doing it through this subtle way that's actually far more dangerous, which might be what Joy James was saying, right? Is like, I will take any day me having to reckon with myself and my internal world about why this disturbs me, right? And in fact, I find that to be a really important and necessary process when it pushes up against me and I have to sit with myself and say, what is going on here? My politics are this. What is it that is in disalignment here? And much of that is an introspection about what of these systems hides seamlessly within me and how that actually gets used and mobilized and animated in very specific moments. They're not innocent moments where that happens. Right? And that can't happen. Let's say, joining in or being complicit with these disciplinary techniques or tactics can't happen if the infrastructure is not there already. And the infrastructure, we have to unfortunately live in a world which we are trying to dismantle, in which the infrastructure dictates that. I don't want to live in a world in which my interior world also reflects that infrastructure. Right. And that's the piece here to constantly push up against. So I just want to read this one piece from idea, because as I was saying that, I remembered this one part in the From piece, which is like, again, to highlight why it might be important to kind of be thinking about these ideas around hate. Our starting point is that we are talking about fascism.
Do you know what page it's on? I can probably pull it up.
Let me see here. Can you do like a search, or I can?
Yeah, I think I can. Yeah, I can.
On the other hand, it says.
What's the word?
On the other hand, love is. Oh, so it's on page 4, under rational hate based on love.
Hang on. Oh wait.
Actually, no. The fight against fascism cannot be fought. Here we go. Sorry, folks.
It's fine.
Okay, here, under hate essential for victory. So it's the bottom of page 5.
Got it.
Right? It's that first paragraph. And here's the thing. That subheading is really important. It says hate essential for victory. And we have to understand what we're talking about. Who are we trying to be, to be victorious over? We are talking about fascism, and that's where you started. And I think it has to be our starting point. Once we sort of locate this fight, this revolutionary fight we're seeing globally, this new sort of infusion of energy into a global anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist movement and an anti-war movement, It's for us to also locate that it's a rise in fascism globally that we are fighting against, whether it's in the context of the United States or in France, as we're seeing, or the UK, or Argentina, or anywhere else, right? Or Venezuela, or anywhere else. That is our starting point. Once that becomes our starting point, it's easy for us to then think about what he's saying here, right? Because under fascism, for fighting fascism, then we have to think about it this way. So he says, on the other hand, the fight against fascism cannot be fought and cannot be won with an emotional business as usual attitude. This fight is not just another unavoidable job over which we need not get emotional. Emotional indifference towards fascism is one of the causes for its triumph in Europe. If there's any cause over which there is good reason to get excited, it is the cause. It is this cause. If there's any group that should be hated, it is the fascists, right? And that's the piece. And here, excited, we can think about in psychoanalytic terms that there's something psychically churned up that is actually really important to fuel, to channel, to galvanize, because this business as usual that we're taught, oh, you need to temper it down a little bit, or why are you so, getting so heated about this? Or, I saw this the other day when they confronted that person who was on CNN who has a job, a book tour now. She actually had the gall to say to the fierce protester who was yelling in her face that she is complicit with genocide. She actually had the gall to say, when you're trying to convince somebody, ma'am, you shouldn't raise your voice. This is the sort of shit that we're dealing with. And for us to think that somehow a good faith engagement in non-passionate affect, which has to include hate, again, hate of the structures and conditions that create the possibility for fascists to come into being and to dominate our political and social world, and to do that in intimate ways, and to do that in larger ways, like the destruction of our world and our climate, and who bears the brunt of all of that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I just want to say a couple other points, because I think for me, and this is where, like, I appreciate some of China's thinking around this too. China Mieville, is from a Marxist perspective, which is important for me, that there is a deep human, humanistic aspect of Marxism, which often gets kind of put to the side a little bit to talk about the dialectical materialism, etc. But like part of what, and the two are related, by the way, because part of what Marx and Engels believed, and part of what the Marxist tradition believes, is that humans can undergo profound changes, right? If they didn't believe that, it would be utopian to think that we could have a classless society, right? But they believe it. They believe that, it is the material conditions, it is the society, right? And the way that it is structured, the structures of that society, how the social relations are forced to work within that society, right? Which sort of determine the forms of humanism, or the forms that humanity takes up within it, right? And so you can use this then to be very clear for folks to separate out, when I'm talking about Zionism, or I'm talking about the structure of the so-called state of Israel, or when I'm talking about imperialism and capitalism, right? That there is space not for, as you say, like sort of a redemption of like a bad ideology or a bad structure to just sort of reform itself, right? But actually for a transformation of the humans that are a part of that structure. However, it's dependent upon the transformation of the structure, right? And so we can't just, try as we might, and a lot of us do, right? We try to be the best humans that we can be within our structures, but through a huge systemic change, right, there is a belief that and it's just borne out by history as well, in terms of, you know, a lot of the ways in which people have, some of the amazing things that people have done, you know, through and after revolutionary moments, in which suddenly society can be structured in a different way, different possibilities become open to people that they didn't experience when they were enslaved or serfs or peasants, or,
Mhm.
you know, or under the rule of a monarch or whatever, right? And so this also becomes the place again for us to be able to think again about the structural hate, right? Like the hatred, to be able to then direct it, right? Because even I love when China talks about this, and he did with the podcast we had with him to talk about this book, but he was like, think about it like a limited supply of ammunition. Like you
Mhm.
can't just go around hating everything. Like it's you know, it's violent, it's dangerous, it has a certain it, there's only so much of it that you can kind of take, right? And this is also interesting, I think, from a psychological level, right? Of like, you know, what does it do if we are just consumed, right, by hatred, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But you know, so he's arguing a very nuanced thing, really, which is just to say that it is natural, it is a human emotion that has always been a part of humanity and every sort of thing. And so if it is directed specifically at structures that need to be dismantled,
Mhm.
then and you know, that it can be something that can be in our arsenal as well, right?
Right. Right.
And that we shouldn't then like police. I mean, this is one of the things too, like there was recently I know a tweet that went out and people very much felt a way about it, about you know, there's still these people who are having these conversations of like, don't say you know, kind of policing people's
Yes.
language,
Yes.
right? And you know, I understand that. I understand trying to be clear and trying to push people to be clear on their terms,
Mhm.
right? And to trying to politically kind of educate, but also it's like, what is the purpose through which we're policing people's I mean, we're in a genocide that's been going on for 11 months. Like, is that really the thing that you
Mhm.
want to direct your language, your
Mhm.
resources
Mhm.
and time towards
Mhm.
right now,
Mhm.
right? Or
Mhm.
do you want to look and say, hey, like there's somebody who's really fired up about this, like maybe I could have a private conversation with them and help them, like, you know, think about it a little bit. But like, that's some, you know, I think about like folks like Wendy Trevino, who will say like, I always look for the people at the end of the protest who are pissed off that it didn't go far enough, and say those are the people that I want to hang out with, those are the
Mhm.
people that I want to then, like, you know,
Mhm.
organize
Mhm.
with or do something with, right? The
Mhm.
people who are not satisfied with the, you know, the march, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a response to that, but I can also,
Y-
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and also being discerning. It's not like you said. I think there is an importance about precision. I think there's an importance about us, being very clear on the parameters of this. I think we want to galvanize around around goals that were what structures we're actually, trying to undo. I think this reminds me of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's idea of, like, it's about what we're building as well, right? What we're bringing into being. It's not just about destruction. This is the difference. So we're always focusing on those things. Um, but also I think in those moments, and I know the tweet that you're talking about there's a way in which one can get caught up in the deflection process and might not be discerning about who that's being directed to and who is it that might be saying these things. I actually think there's a very big difference, and that I tend to have a lot more latitude and a lot more generosity and space of generosity within me when I can understand who it is that's articulating things that might be, distasteful to me, or not the way that I would phrase it. But then if I'm looking within the context of who this is, like, give them a fucking break. If it's Palestine, especially Palestinians on the ground, who, by the way, their reality is completely configured differently, right? And so the words they might use or what they say actually has its roots also in the Zionist entity that claims to speak, number one, for all Jews in the world, and who happens to also insist on the supremacy of Jewish people within that occupied land. So it doesn't feel to be the same, the same need that I have to sort of go after somebody within that context. Like you said, I've had plenty of conversations one-on-one with folks. I think there's a larger political education that's happening, but there's also a discernment, and there's a piece of like, an indulgence that maybe we don't need to get into when we can apprehend the larger context. And like you're saying, energy is, finite. We all see this. We're completely, sort of always recommitting every single day to use every ounce of energy that we have to continue this fight and to not despair and to not slow down, because that's precisely what is being watched for. We can see this, for example, in the universities. Like, I think I texted this to you at some point, like these administrators thought these students were going to go away on break, get exhausted, and come back having been completely depleted, and that they could reconfigure the whole university and nobody would push back. And they showed them something completely different, but that takes a daily commitment to that, right? And this is part of it, is also a relational commitment. If we're talking about abolitionist ways of being, it's not just about, the actual, structures that which is very important, what we're dismantling, but also the ways in which we relate to each other and the ways in which we enact systems of domination and extractiveness and deflectiveness, just like we were just saying, like what comes to live inside of us, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And somebody asked where they could find this piece. It looks like you can find it on
Do you want to just
from online. Do you have the link?
Yes, I think
Okay.
let me get
But
it for
if
you.
not, they can find it probably on the
I
website,
got you.
online.org. Okay.
Here you go.
All right.
I put it in our.
I will share it real quick with folks. And so we can shift and talk a little bit about love, right? And I think that also, like, I see some people, which I'm not surprised by, being a little bit disturbed by some of this discussion. But I think that the point, right, is again, you're talking about structure, right? You're talking about, and we're talking about emotions that we all, maybe not all, actually that's the point. And China says this too in our discussion with him. He's like, this came from conversations that he had with other comrades, right, where some of them were like, no, we can't have a place for this, like there's no place for hate within our movements, right? And it's too, toxic, et cetera, right? um and he was talking, very particularly about a hatred for capitalism, a hatred for a class society, right? And he talks about individuals. He's like, it's very easy to get caught up and to sort of feel hatred for Trump or for Martin Shkreli, is the guy that he uses, Pharma Bro, who like actually kind of wanted people to hate him. And that's the other thing, is like when I see that video, right, of the two Jewish podcasters, in the two Israeli, Jewish podcasters, doing that discussion about, pushing the button and being able to basically wipe out Palestinian life. They put that out in part, like, I mean, this is like, and this is one of the things I hate about how social media operates sometimes, right, is that they also wanted us all to share this and to get angry at it, right? And they knew that the rage would also fuel the virality of it, which would also bring people in that agree with them, but also would just sort of create this big buzz, and so there's that element too. But Mieville's like very clear. He's like, he said, you'll have bad faith people who say, so you hate the bourgeoisie, you hate capitalism, so does that mean you want to kill everybody? That, it's like, no, like nobody is saying that, right? That is not actually what we're saying, right? But it is that you want to change the very conditions that would put them in a place where they could have the power to do these things,
Yeah.
right? So like one example of that would be, just as a starting point, right, would be people who are fighting for arms embargoes, right? If
Hmm.
people who are fighting, like, one of the conditions that enables the Zionist entity to do this is that it is armed to the teeth by the West to do it,
Right.
right?
Right.
Um, and there's much more to that, but like just understanding that as a distinction, right, between like what are the material conditions that allow this to happen versus like what, who are the individual actors, again, getting away from,
Yes.
we can get, and this is the socialization aspect, right? So it's
Yep.
like it's very easy for us to get angry at these two, 20 something guys who are having this ridiculous conversation and that it's being allowed to be shared and spread,
Hmm.
right? It's very easy for us to get angry at Benjamin Netanyahu, or at Ben Gvir or whatever, right? But that's not actually a structural hate, right? So then the impulse that we need to lean into, right, is to move from that feeling that is often triggered by an individual's actions and getting angry at that action, right, to like, why are they in a place where they're able to say this?
Hmm.
Why are they in a place where they're able to do these things, right?
Hmm.
And how do we change that, right? Which then, that's where I think you can take that anger that we all, not, again, I shouldn't say all, that many of us feel at seeing some of these things and saying, okay, what do I do with that? Like, and that's where I kind of want to go next. The
Yes.
one small thing. Um, so there's a lot people can do, and there's a lot that people are doing. I'm, on one level, I said this before, I feel like we're putting a lot on students, and I want
Hmm.
everybody that can to kind of take a lead from students and figure out ways that they can turn up. But I think that the the there is an importance of the student aspect of this that just can't be
Hmm.
denied. I mean,
Hmm.
we've seen the student intifada.
Hmm.
We're seeing students who are, um, they're radicalizing. They're taking action. I had conversation with somebody the other day from that movement, and I was just like, I'm very inspired by the bravery and courage and kind of disciplined commitment that at least some of the people that I encounter within that movement have to like, I don't really care about what my career or my life could be if I can't struggle to stop this. Like,
Right.
that's not
What
important
does
to
it
me.
matter? Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I want to like, I think it's important for all of us to kind of to lean into like grounding ourselves as much as we can. I recognize very complicated for a lot of us who have jobs and children and all kinds of things that we have to like think about. So
Right.
that may be different for everybody. It is different for everybody. Um, Another aspect of love that I wanted to talk about, is, so I had a conversation with Louis all day, who, like, first of all, I love Louis all day. I just want to say that for the record, for everybody to hear. I have a bromance, plutonic man crush on Louis all day, but um, we had this discussion, recently, and we got into talking about GoFundMe's. It was actually because we did a little bit of like check-in of like, how are you, right? I asked him that, and he was like, do you want the 2 hour version or the like the glib sort of comment? And I was like, somewhere in between, right? Like, I don't want the 2 hour version, but I do kind of genuinely want to know. And he was talking about, working with people in Gaza, to get them, funds, which Louis been doing a ton of on Twitter, in for months now. And as an interesting pivot for him, because I think Louis is somebody, for anybody who knows him, like, he's a very structural person. He's a very like, he he edited and published the issue of Ebb magazine, which I still think is one of the best things that's been, published, of a comprehensive set of conversations around Palestine since October 7th. Um, and he's been dedicated to Palestine and, Lebanon and like solidarity in the region for a very long time. And so, you know, we talking about GoFundMe's, and he's talking about the difficulties, right? One of like GoFundMe as a company keeps
Mm.
defunding the GoFundMe's with like often tens, sometimes over $100,000 of like funding that's going to help people do these like mutual aid projects that they're doing, like whether that's like, you know, buying up tents for tons of people. Obviously, the need for medicines is
Yeah.
immense. The need for food is immense. It's very easy for us to also say, like, why do we have to do this over GoFundMe? Like, the the NGOs should be doing this. More importantly, the United States and the Zionist entity should be doing this. They should be reparations paid. Everything should be rebuilt. Like, why does this have to become an individual, response through a very neoliberal platform
Hmm.
of fundraising, right? And I've thought about that, you know, but I think that yesterday my conversation with Louis helped, and I'll go back to a little bit more of it in a minute. But yesterday, Janine Hurani, who we had on, we talked about, she talked about also like recalibrating how we think about this. And it brought me back to something that we talked with Abdul Jawad Omar about as well, of, there, for one, we have, resources, right, that we have. And so that differs for everybody. Often I don't have a lot that I can share because I just don't have a lot of money right now. But the point that Janine made, that I think was really important in reframing this, right? Is she talks about Taziz Samud,
تعزيز الصمود. Mhm.
right? So this is basically, say a little bit to folks about what Samud is.
So صمود, very quickly, it's steadfastness, and I don't say it very quickly to take away from it, but it's one of these words that is very hard to translate accurately. So it's been translated as steadfastness, it's been translated as stalwartness. It emerges from the Palestinian political prisoners and really is a social and political project. It's not just like a thing I do. It is a larger structure of maintaining commitment to the liberation of Palestine, to maintaining presence, to maintaining psychic clarity. This is why Walid Daqa is a central sort of and his work around Syrian consciousness is essential in that, and why it does emerge as a practice. So sumud is a practice, as we talk about in our book as well. Is a political collective practice, not an individual project, right? And it's one that asserts and affirms the presence of indigenous Palestinian life. And that is precisely why the Zionist entity has always resorted to atomization and dismemberment and disconnection, because their thinking is that itself can puncture and sort of slow down the practice, the collective practice of sumud, right? And presence. And I think in many ways, it's actually done the exact opposite. It actually allows places of flourishing sumud.
Thank you. Yeah. And so so this is supporting their steadfastness, might be a rough translation, right? And so the idea being, I mean, one, if we understand that it's a genocide, which we do,
Mm-hmm.
then we also understand, and we understand the multiple kind of registers that it's operated under, right? Like there's the medical component of it, which is very clear. They've destroyed all of the hospitals, all of the healthcare infrastructure in Gaza. Um, there are still, however, like things that people can access, which is, and Louis was like, I don't really even understand like how some of this works. Like, how are
Yeah.
you getting like that? There's a bank. He's identified there's a bank in West Bank that I can get money to, that is able to transfer it to a place in Gaza where people can still access it, right? And some of it is digital. He doesn't really understand the liquidity situation, all of that, but people are still able to buy things, right? And so if they can buy food, if they can get access to medicine, right, then these things actually are keeping people alive.
Mm-hmm.
And so that point, I think is just essential for us to understand, right? Is that, and it's not to say, I want to be clear too, because part of it is when you start to do this, it's very easy to get overwhelmed in multiple ways. One, uh, my DMs are full of dozens
Mm-hmm.
of people who are asking me to boost their campaigns, and I can't possibly do all of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that feels awful, right? So there's that. Um, but what I encourage people to do, and I think Louis has kind of set an example of it too, is that like you can pick, I mean, and you're just going to have to do it, I think, very arbitrarily, right? And just say, hey, I'm going to take one or two
Yeah.
of these campaigns and I'm going to give to it and I'm going to boost it as many times as I can, right? And I think if more people did this, right? They said, hey, I'm just going to take one or two campaigns and I'm just going to do this. It does have, like, there's no denying that this has a material impact. Now, it is not, I'm not suggesting it's a solution. I'm not suggesting people should do this instead of other organizing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because it's obviously it's not a solution in and of itself. It's not a sustainable practice by any
Mm-hmm.
means.
Mm-hmm.
There's finite resources, finite people, blah, blah, blah. Um, but I think that if you understand it as part of way Janine talked about it as an aspect of a survival program that we could be contributing to, that is meaningful. And a lot of people are doing this. I'm going to bring up one example here that's going on that I'm familiar with in Philly, because they did a great fundraiser at Making Worlds recently. Many people will know the author Susan Abuhawa.
A big shout out to her.
She's amazing. She runs a nonprofit that's called Playgrounds for Palestine. That for a long time, that's what they did, is they helped build playgrounds and things like that. And she was actually at a point where she was getting ready to kind of sunset the nonprofit to fold it into something else. And then the genocide happened. And so what they have done is, I'll pull it up so people can see, and I'll also share the link. But what they have done is basically, there's a school, Phoenix Elementary in Gaza, that they've launched, and they're actually providing elementary school to, I think, about 140 students right now in Gaza. They don't know, and this was like really emotional to hear
Mm.
her talk about this too, right? They don't know that it won't be targeted and bombed, right?
Right.
Like they don't know that.
Right.
But what they do know is that they have teachers there and that they have students there, and that they're able to provide them resources, and that they're hopeful to continue to expand and serve more kids, because one of the things he also talked about is they'll be having school and there are literally dozens of other children who just sit outside of the school to try to listen and see a little bit of what's
Mm.
going on.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and so anyway, I encourage folks to support that as something that people can support. And I also just encourage people to like think about this survival plan strategy. And maybe it's not GoFundMe. It's like, one thing is like GoFundMe is like defunding a lot of these campaigns. I know Louis prefers to work with chuffed.org because they seem to be not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, GoFundMe often, we don't know for sure why they're defunding them. They don't explain, but we think that it's actually that they're probably taking direction from Israel, that's saying like, hey, that one has too much money, like cut it down. Not, I'm sure Israel's saying other things like this is supporting Hamas or
Right.
whatever else
Right.
that they would say, right?
Right.
Um, so I think that like just thinking about all of that. And Louis said, and I did want to share this too, that he thinks a lot of people don't do it. I mean, there's all the sort of reasons that we talked about in terms of like maybe thinking it's neoliberal or whatever else. But the real reason that he thinks a lot of people don't do it is because then you open a direct line of communication very often, because when you share people's campaign, they will reach out to you directly very
Mm-hmm.
often. They'll
Mm-hmm.
thank you. They'll be very, they'll often explain that, what, try to convince you that they're deserving, which is just such a hard thing to like. You don't have to convince me that you're deserving, right?
Mm-hmm.
um but and so I think psychically, again, like that is a it makes genocide very real, when you're talking to people who are like, you know, this is what's happened to my kids today. This is what's going on. This is
They're
what we're
real
trying. This is
people.
the, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, I encourage people to think about it, but I think also like there are a lot of campaigns that are going on in communities, right, already, where it's like, this is, these are my relatives that are in Gaza. This is a family that we know. This is a group that we're trying to, and so like I encourage people also to think about that is, there was one that reached out to me. It was like Minnesota Families for Palestine, and they asked if they could like make me a collaborator on an IG post to promote their fundraiser. And I was like, sure,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, that's the other thing, is that you don't have to go through these platforms. Like, you can organize it yourself, but think about ways that you can fundraise and get some direct aid to people as an aspect of struggle. Because also, to go back, and this is the last thing I'll say, but Abdul Jawad, I think, was correct, obviously, months and months ago, when he said this is going to be longer
Yes.
than we thought,
Yeah.
right? And you do, there's, as I think it's Justin Potter who says it, like with every episode of Sit Rep, of like no end in sight, right? Is the
Mm-hmm.
thing that he
Mm-hmm.
says,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that, given that it is really, I think we could think about it as a duty, as wajib, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To think about, like, how do we help sustain people
Yeah.
through this that are trying to sustain themselves, right? And really, they don't have anywhere to go, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So anyways,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that's
I think it's, to sort of take where you left off, is that if we're thinking about this as, like you said, if we understand this to be a genocide, which we do, and if we understand it as being a wholesale targeting of every aspect of life and living and infrastructure, and the people who sustain that infrastructure, like doctors, like teachers, like, an old man who feeds cats, or somebody who plants, or any one of these things, then we can think also about our duty or wajib to sustain that life as also having to be multi-layered and multi-strategic too. We can't just expect that one way or one method is going to be able to sustain that that project and the actual living of people. And quite frankly, on a personal level, I don't ever want to be in a situation where I am sort of thinking of myself as not having engaged in that for all these sort of potentially cynical reasons, even if the cynical reasons actually bear out, right? Is that there's a way in which, again, a redistribution of our wealth and our privileges, and that might not look like a lot, by the way, but those of us who are not under an active genocide have that in just by virtue of not being in an active genocide. And so what does it mean for us to be thinking about diversified methods of, right, taziz el-sumud, that it has to be diversified because the modes of attack are also diversified, and they're like that on purpose, because there are so many spaces of life and living, kind of like you said, of like, how does this even still happen? Well, we can say that about pretty much anything, about people living in conditions that we could never think about, including, by the way, in political prisoners, of smuggling out sperm or digging a tunnel and with a spoon to free yourself and your comrades. Like, if we're always thinking in these ways about how could it be possible, then perhaps we're also not opening up the necessary spaces of like what we can actually enact and make possible with these ways. Like, kind of like what you're saying, that it might not be a sustainable practice. Of course not, because if our focus is on dismantling structures, that can't be the only way that we do it. But at this particular, are there stages of energetic sort of pull that we have? And can we push ourselves to be expansive enough to think about it in these ways? That's shifting every single day, by the way, right? Like there was a period of time where there was no funding happening, because I think people were trying to sort of get their bearings and sort of say, how can we do this? And now we see the terrain shifting constantly, and that's okay too. I think it might be disruptive, it might feel disorienting in some ways. There is a psychic impact, I think. Particularly what I've heard from a lot of people is feeling guilty about not being able to attend to all of them, or being put in a position to have to pick, like you said, arbitrarily, where then you're sort of engaged in this process of a hierarchy of deservedness, when nobody should have to be in this position to begin with. But again, I think if we go back to the condition and the structure, that's a helpful way for us to think about different modes and different paces and in different time frames, especially since this is long drawn out. We can't expect that the same approaches we had at the beginning are going to be what we have now, or even what's to come in the next couple of weeks or next couple of months or anything like that. I just also want to say that I thank you for noting that folks are discomforted or having difficulty with this conversation. And I want to say that I can't see the conversation that's happening, but I so appreciate people sort of struggling alongside us. And I think this is what Jay and I are really doing, is like, how do we struggle publicly around these things? Because there's a way in which I think that this struggle alone is precisely what alienates us and what causes us to retract into individualistic modes. That ties into this conversation we're having right now. Like, I'm moved by the fact that you and a comrade that you don't live near each other can have this conversation and really, you know, push up against the seams and say, hey, I'm struggling with this piece of it. Can we think this through? And then through the conversations you have with people who come on the show, and then publicly, I think the public facing aspect of this is actually incredibly important, because I imagine that many of us are having these thoughts. Many of us are having these feelings. Many of us feel the contradictions. Many of us feel angered around the contradictions, or that we are in this place this many months later where we are still having to think about this. At the same time, we're considering the actual reality that people don't have tents even to live in. And when they do, those tents are targeted. Right, that they become actual targets around this. So there's like a way in which we can bring into focus the real urgency that we're talking about, and that there are humans, not just people behind, you know, phones and Instagram, even though we owe everything to them for showing us and having the generosity and the urgency to be like, through all of this, I'm going to have you actually join in this and insist that we join them in what is happening to them, because many of us actually are citizens or pay taxes to countries that are enacting this, right? And it is actually, that is another wedge, is to be like, this is me being in the ways that I can, being in this with you, and maybe part of the GoFundMe's or any one of these things that we're thinking about are a part of that. I also just want to say, you know, you kick this off with talking about love, right? And that there's this way in which love and hate, and we were talking about it, is that I think, you know, revolutionary love, and this is what Fromm talks about, is that there's a way in which anybody who, this is paraphrasing from Fromm, anybody who has loved also has a capacity to hate, because there's a way in which your identifications with the things that you love, or the things you're building, or the world that you want to have your kids inherit or future generations inherit, it has to be undergirded by love. I don't think there's any other way we can do that. I think that's why I talk a lot about revolutionary love, and I think you put Che in there, and he's somebody that's very much thought about when we think about this. But also Fanon, right? When you talk about like there's a human, I mean, that's why Marxism, Fanon was a Marxist, and his idea of like profound change that needs to be, by the way, pushed through duress to actually have that change happen, right? It's not just a passive way that's I think maybe that's the version of what I talk about, of a commitment, a daily commitment in which we sustain this pressure to exact that transformation and have that doesn't happen without a commitment. And that commitment, I don't think, can happen without an alignment about what we are actually fighting against. Yes, that's the fascistic piece, but also fighting for. Like, what is it that we're actually trying to bring into being? I'm going to drop a quote from Fanon that helps me with this, and maybe this will clarify for some folks around like what Jay and I are trying to struggle through together. It's from Black Skin, White Masks. And here we go. I put it in the chat for you. It's from Black Skin, White Masks. And this is him sort of like reorienting us to about revolutionary love and what we're committed to, and also what we are opposed to structurally. And that's our compass. And maybe it's an oscillation between these things. And our struggle and our fight is, how do we commit ourselves both to the fullness of that experience? That if there's a revolutionary love, there's also an understanding about the forces and the structures and the conditions that we must hate, right? Yes to life, yes to love, yes to generosity. And there's also a no to scorn of man, no to degradation of man, no to exploitation of man, no to the butchery of what is most human in man, freedom, right? And that sort of synergistic process between these forces, these psychic forces of hate and love, and the discipline it takes, that hate is directed not nihilistically, but towards the structures that create degradation, scorn, exploitation, and butchery of freedom. Right? And that's, again, that is a commitment. And that is a daily commitment. I can say that I, every day, right, struggle to make sure I'm in alignment with that. And it's not easy. It's not easy when you're interacting with folks who are struggling just to stay alive in a condition that is not of their making and is not necessary, right? It's not an organic condition, nor is it necessary. And nobody is going to tell me that there was anything of this entire 11 month that was actually necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, also to go back to the George Jackson quote for a minute, it's like, if I think anybody, well, I shouldn't say things like that. I think a lot of people can understand that if you love people, like, if you truly love people, then like, have you ever had somebody do something really messed up to your kids, right? Or to your partner, right? Or to your parents, right? And to suggest that we don't have, like, I mean, my response is not like, oh, I love that person that just did that to my kid, or I'm indifferent to that person who just did that to my kid, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to, I don't know. So anyways, I just
Yes.
want to say that because, George Jackson says, like, to the destruction of their enemies, I dedicate my
Yes.
lives. You have to think about, like, with George Jackson in particular, like, what are the circumstances in which, he's writing this, right?
Right.
Like, he was incarcerated for, a year, right? That had endless, you could come up for parole every year and never be allowed to be released, right? So it was like a 1 to infinity sentence basically that he had, right?
Yep.
And his brother has been, killed trying to basically negotiate either a prison swap, right, or something along these lines, right? And then he's talking about his mother, and he's talking about Angela Davis, who was his partner at the time, and so, yeah, I mean, like, if you love them, then, and these people have real enemies, right? Like, this
Yeah.
is not like, we're not talking about, and I think so. I appreciate that. I also appreciate the point you said, through that. I can't remember exactly what you said, but, discussing about what's required to change things, right? And the kind of, you know, and again, like, I cannot help but continue to think about the resistance, right? The people are still, putting up fights every day in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and sacrificing in, like, very real ways that I think are unimaginable to so many of us because of a dedication, right? And because of, um, a recognition also that that is not changing through, the liberal humanitarian like paradigms and systems, the liberation is not going to come, through those means, right? And so I think again, like that's also something to always kind of for me to go back to in thinking about these things. And I guess in thinking about that too, part of what I would say in thinking about these concepts is, look, I believe that I believe all of them are motivated by a revolutionary love, right?
Mhm.
They might also be partially motivated by their hatred for, and I'm sure many of them are, by their hatred of the system of oppression that their people are
Mhm.
um, subjected to, right?
Mhm.
And I think that is, as as China says in this piece, it is a perfectly rational thing. Like I think we should hate oppression. I think we should. So
Yes.
I guess I'll,
Yes.
I'll I'll say that to kind of wrap up that side of
Mm.
things. But
Yeah. Yeah. A hatred of their enemy, kind of like the George Jackson thing, right? Like and what does it mean when a hatred of their enemy? If we can put the pressure on ourselves to understand that the hatred of your enemy is also representative of larger, what if that enemy is systemic, like racial capitalism, like imperialism, like Zionism, right? That codifies a system in which you are dehumanized and tortured systematically, right? Not on an individual basis. And that is, I think, the seams that I want to push up against. Is like, what is it about that is hard for us that we have to package it up in a neater way, that it has to be, right? Because if that is your enemy, just like Fromm was telling us, if fascism is your enemy, then that becomes a fair target of this psychic force that can fuel action, that can fuel clarity, commitment, if it also is underwritten by a commitment to what Fanon's saying here is no to the scorn of man. And that's, for me, it's like that's the difference between a nihilistic and then a revolutionary love, that we commit ourselves. And by the way, that includes sacrifices that come with that, which could include ourselves, right? And very much is the case when we're talking about actual resistance fighters and freedom fighters.
yeah, absolutely. I think we can take questions from the audience
Yeah.
because I think we've pretty much gone through what I had laid out. Nutter, so good to see you again. Always show up for these lives. I appreciate you. So do you notice forces forces within the establishment trying to direct the movement towards things like tough on Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian hate crimes? What do you think about them? I know that Nader is asking this, I believe, from Egypt, right? So it's like, probably asking also in different contexts. Um, I actually, I'll say for me that there is not, from what I see, maybe there is some of this going on college campuses, but for the most part, Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian um, is not even a bigotry or racism or form of hatred that the establishment really wants to deal with and try to combat right now. I think because they're probably worried that opening up that door then requires them to talk about genocide, right? Because how can you say, I'm against Islamophobia and I'm against, uh, you know, hate against Palestinians right now, right? Uh, when this is such a kind of hegemonic thing that the United States is engaged in, from obviously on one side, Trump, talking about, that using Palestinian as a slur, right, to people. Um,
Mhm.
say he called I think he called Joe Biden a bad Palestinian or something like that is what he called him, something along those lines, right? To the flip side, where you have Kamala just following with that rhetoric of you know the I'm speaking when the Palestinian protesters are trying to make their point to her, to this bullshit rhetoric around ceasefire, which is just people need to understand that what that means to the United States is that they're trying to negotiate the surrender of Palestinians to what Israel wants, right? Like that's what they're trying to negotiate, right? And that is why the negotiations haven't been successful so far, because the resistance, is not willing to accept, basically even what's being proposed is something worse and more oppressive and more colonizing, right, than what preceded October 7th, even, is like basically the Philadelphia corridor would be, held by Zionists. There would be an occupying army still in Gaza, like, etc. Right. So anyway, the question, we can go back to it and you can respond from your
Yeah.
thing, from your point of view, but was about, are we seeing folks directing move towards, I would say what you do get is you get a generic conversation about, we want all students to feel comfortable, but it is most often directed at Zionists. It is most often a desire of the university to make it feel like, to appeal to the emotions of Zionists who feel some type of way about Jewish and Palestinian and everybody else students organizing against, the direct complicity of universities in bombing, really, right? Because that's really what people are often organizing on the ground against. And so, yeah, that's what I'm seeing, is it, from what I've seen from a distance, is very little actual, at this point, even lip service to worrying about anti-Palestinian hate or Islamophobia.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that it's interesting to see, like, years ago, even a couple years ago, the ADL would come out with a statement against Islamophobia, right? And like, obviously, we're not seeing any of that, because that is usually when it's a white supremacist or something like that, then the ADL feels comfortable enough to step in and try to gain some sort of credibility and traction as an actually, laughably so, as a respectable sort of quote unquote civil rights organization that actually comments or gives a fuck about Islamophobia, while they're actually churning out and sort of fanning the flames of what actually creates that, right? But there was a sort of investment in the valence of actually being, against these sorts of things. And we have seen less of that. I do see statements from professional organizations or listservs or universities that'll stick in, Islamophobia just like as an afterthought. Oh, and Islamophobia, right? But again, it's very telling now that, and I appreciate the question, it's very telling that it is in this sort of catch-all Islamophobia, which I do think in a sort of mainstream way that it has become more comfortable in the United States to say this word, while of course not sort of looking at the sort of structural underpinnings, or as Stephen might say in his book, ideological underpinnings of Islamophobia, at the heart of which is anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian hate. So I'm finding this as such a fascinating sort of turn of events, where if you, by what you're saying now, that is like creating an umbrella that is actually easier to sort of be like, this is Islamophobia, this is anti-Muslim, where the precision is actually needed here. Yes, there is anti-Muslim animus in the United States. We know that this is right as a sort of centerpiece of racism too. And there's work being done, Stephen and others, that talk about it as an offshoot of anti-Black racism as well. But that's not, the specification of this is like, it's not just some random Muslim in the middle of nowhere in the world. We are talking about a conflation of all Muslims with Palestine, particularly those who are, mobilized around Palestine, and that might be what we're talking about. But nobody is naming that this is the target is the people who are opposing a genocide, and that is where the attacks come from. Any of the racist Islamophobic attacks we see, whether or not someone is Muslim doesn't matter. What matters is, are they pro-Palestine and engaging particularly on campuses in a sort of pushing up against their administrators and the university around their complicity in genocide. So the other thing that I will say that this question brought up for me is a real sort of attunement that you have, Nader, to the ways in which institutions create proper channels by which we can sort of take up our issues or concerns with very real material impact that is happening. And it's akin to me, when I read that, I was like, oh, this proper channel is akin, if you just call it Islamophobia alone, which it is in part, but also let's be clear about what's the root cause of this, or what's generating, or why is there an uptick right now in this? It's akin to the trauma industry in psychology sort of wanting to have traumas without a traumatizer. You want to just say there's Islamophobia happening without being like, can we be clear on the fact that there is a vicious Zionist force on campuses, an ideological force that is creating and threatening fear, manufacturing annihilatory anxiety, which is one way that I think about it, to which the response is Islamophobia. And that response is Islamophobia because anybody who rallies behind the question of Palestinian liberation, not just, docility or Palestinian ceasefire where we can go back to, again, business as usual. The asks and the demands are bigger. There is no going back to that. We're not taking crumbs anymore from people. And I think that's why, if there's a proper channel, it's to defang the fact that the movement is focused on total liberation and the right of return. There's no in between here, right? So if the proper channels are constructed, it's precisely to take away from the movement and the energy that is around that sort of demand.
Yeah. And I'm sure there is some of that going on. Like you say, I mean, there is often in the statements, some level of, recognition of, I mean, it's so funny. Like, there's so many stories I have, a friend of mine who just started at a school, I'll just say a liberal arts college in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We can say that because there's a bazillion of them. Anyway, talking about like the DEI like presentation, right, at their school, and like of course no mention, right? And then they ask like questions, and like he's like, the one Arab professor who's on staff is like, hey, there's a genocide going on, like,
yeah,
and no response. Like the like, okay, next person, like, right?
yep.
And then like somebody says something. He was like, I actually thought the next person was a plant, maybe, because they asked something about the schedule, and then there was a 45-minute discussion about the schedule, and then like, the thing was over. There wasn't time for more questions, kind of thing, and like, so yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. Obviously, we're seeing all the ways that universities are, developing all kinds of policies. The big one, like in, I don't know if this is everywhere, but I have friends in the Cal State system and in other, UC system, stuff like that. And there's a lot of use of what do they call it? Time, manner, and something like time, manner, and something else. There's three things. But it's like these sort of procedures, these campus things, right? So it's not actually, these aren't like big, like, I guess it's policy, but it's like kind of this weird lane of policy, right? That is, and basically like they're just being expanded in all of these ways.
Yes.
So like, for instance, one of my friends who's at a CSU, campus, like they got a policy that said that this went out to faculty, right? So this wasn't even just to students, but they said the faculty couldn't possess camping equipment, and
Yes.
it also included furniture, which is like he was. So anyways, my friend was like, I'm going to REI right now to buy like a bunch of shirts that say like I love fishing, and like I'm going camping, and like you know
Yes.
um
Yeah. But that
yeah.
sort of
So
stuff was piloted by like I don't know if you remember this, but the University of Virginia last year, on the eve of the encampment, changed its policy at like 10 a.m. in the morning. Change your policy online without it going through. I mean, forget about, right, like due process and voting and all this stuff, to say that tents were not allowed on their like green quad or whatever in the space. So that was piloted, and that was done in the morning to change the policy to incriminate students immediately. And I think obviously we're seeing these quote unquote proper channels be disseminated across universities. And really what it's doing is creating a space of managing and cracking down on dissent in every way possible, including, by the way, incredibly ableist and dangerous things like anti-masking, which is what we are seeing also in the California system, right? These anti-masking policies.
that's happening in a lot of places. It's also in New
Yep.
York, I believe.
Yep.
This I believe is correct. I think it's time, manner, and place, or something similar to this, right? And then Dr. Jared Ball, uni presidents, definitely put plants in the town halls. Good to
Mm-hmm.
see you. Sorry to hear about Earn Your Liberation. Today was the last episode of that, but shout out to everything that goes on at Black Liberation Media. Appreciate all the work that you all do.
Mm-hmm.
And unabashed, unapologetic, unembittered hater. All right. I also appreciated Arif put these in a little while ago. I mean, this is something that is always within the resistance statements. I imagine that it's a Quranic kind of passage, but permission to fight has been granted to those who are being fought because they are being wronged, or they have been wronged. I've often read it, and indeed they shall fight. They shall find Allah is most competent to grant them victory. Right, and I think that I mean, this is something. I think somebody in the chat also said that this is one of the reasons, perhaps, that we might say that Islam, you know, is so targeted often by the West, right? Is because if you read a passage like that and you kind of take what it means, right? That if you are wronged, and that if people have fought you, that you have permission to fight back, right? I mean, that is an anti-colonial principle, right? Is to say that if you've been colonized, then you got a right to fight, and I think that that is something that certainly the West doesn't want to ever allow for, right? The violence only is U.S. imperialism is an attempt to have a global monopoly on violence,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
where
And
it
that the state
the
owns that.
yeah. Um, so this was a good question. This is definitely a question for you. My question would be around, what are the somatic or
Mm,
affective embodied responses that might indicate we should be curious about the conditioning under them?
yes. Thank you for that question. Um, I imagine they're varied. I will share personally that when I have a response that feels out of the ordinary for me, like it's way too big in its response for what I'm actually seeing, that might be so I might feel angered quickly, or I do see sort of an elevation of my heartbeat, or you flush, something that sort of immediately indicates you something is happening. It doesn't mean that it's something is happening, meaning a sort of sign to me that can I sort of create psychic space. And by the way, that sometimes is not done alone. Sometimes there has to be an introspection enough to sort of recognize, oh, this is happening. But most of the time, for me at least, that's processed, certainly with my partner and talking through about these things. And I want to say that sometimes it takes a while for us to really piece together. What I notice sometimes also is that something is sticking to me. Like it's in the back of my mind. I'm kind of like working through it. Or there's something that I feel ashamed about. Or feel, upset with myself. Like, why did I react that way? Right? Or what is it about this thing that generated this response in me anyway that might be different than any of those? Certainly when there's a different response than what we might be used to, that's a good clue. But shame is also a really big clue for us about, like, there's something that feels off kilter here. And that is, and we might feel shame in an embodied way very differently. So that's why I'm not trying to be elusive or like sort of not give you direct answers. It's sort of really giving permission for us to sort of check in and say, where is it that these things live inside our body? Where do we feel things? And that is the introspective piece, because we tend to know or have a hunch around these things and about where they live in our bodies, right? And then to hopefully have the space and the relational capacity and nourishment to be able to think through these pieces and to really reckon with them and I'll speak for myself and hold myself accountable around these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I can share from myself that, like, one of the things that definitely has occurred, is that, like, sometimes it's actually paying attention to my kids' behavior around me and realizing that their response, whether it's like attention-seeking behavior that even can, take forms that we might not want it to be, like whacking me over the head or something like that, right? But having to, like, also kind of like deconstruct, like, this is actually happening because, like, thinking about what's going on, why are there these, why would they lash out in this way, or yell at me or whatever. And it's like, it's because I've become, at times I've become so absorbed, right, in, like, whether it's doom scrolling or whatever it is, right? But I am, and also just affected, right? So this is where it gets to affect, right? In a way that I'm really not there in the way that they need me to be, right? And so then, I mean, often when I get my bearings, like, my good response to it is like, let's just go for a walk. Like, getting outside often is very, it's, like, this is very goofy, like Twitter, but, like, go touch grass. I mean, it's very real. I mean, I think we had a conversation a few years ago with Alex Terrell, uh, and on, like, Soviet pedagogy, and he goes into this thing of the Soviet pedagogue who, like, basically, would always teach students in nature. And there was actually, he gets to the heart, like, there's actually a scientific reason for this, and it's that trees actually emit, like, sort of chemicals, right? Like, biochemical, however we want to think about this. Like, there's, you know, thinking, I'm not, obviously I'm not a chemist and I'm not a biologist, so I'm gonna mess up explaining this, right? But, like, there are, similar to, like, how CO2 or something like that might come out of, or oxygen, I guess, right, would come out of trees, right? That there are other aspects of this, and that it actually improves our sense of, like, well-being, right? And can kind of restore us. And so, like, if you have access to, park or nature in that way, like, I think it can be a good way to kind of, you know literally go outside and take some deep breaths and reset yourself, which sometimes is something that I have to do. Obviously it doesn't address the cause of
Right.
what I'm feeling, right? And that's not going to be addressed until until Palestine is free, ultimately,
Mhm,
liberated from the river to the sea. But
mhm.
it does give me that ability then to, like, okay, like, clear my head, as people say, right? And, do the things that I need to do, right? Which I have real adult responsibilities to be a parent and to be present and to attend
Yeah.
to their needs as well, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
you're describing a practice of desalination, we could call that, right? Whether it's literally actually connecting to in this sort of hyper capitalist world that distracts you from the environment in which you live, right? Like we could be inside and just completely excise the reality that there's an ecosystem completely around us. And what does that mean? And I think Basil al-Araj's idea about enchantment, re-enchanting the world, like these are all processes of desalination. But also this idea of like, why is it that catching a breath or taking a breath or regulating our nervous system or all that, like fundamentally, if it stops there, that can get caught up in the self-help industry. That's a billion-dollar industry that's about consuming more things. What I hope is that like we do those things to create psychic space so that we can realign with the political commitments of the world that we want to, whether that is you being present with your kids, right, in service of something larger, right? Not because it's just a disciplinary tactic of this is the right way to be a parent, but because you're working towards something bigger in that relationality and in being able to be present in those ways for them and recognizing what they might need in your particular role as their father. It's not some random person they're asking this from, right? You're their dad. So I think that if we can think about it, all these practices as modes of desalination, then we can also then in that space, right, to go back to that question is being like, what are the forces that might entice us into further alienation, and what do I need to do to disrupt that? And so maybe the symptom is, I've talked about this before, about how the symptom is a register, that embodied symptom is it's not for us to get that away. So that breathing is not a way, it's actually an ability to contend with that in honest ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Jared talking about then his time in the military, being on a ship with no no metal, or all metal, no soil, no
Yep.
grass, and then thinking about prison. And I want to also say yesterday's conversation with Kaleem and Janine around incarceration was really good. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
also we had a really good conversation with Gunna Abaganam, from, also on Walid Daka. So we've had a couple of really good conversations on his thinking and his writing and his thought and how he thought about incarceration in relation to, um, settler colonialism and the Palestinian experience and the separation of Palestinians into um, different prisons, right? To think
Mm-hmm.
about, meaning Gaza, the West Bank, the occupied, or
Mm-hmm.
no, 48, the diaspora, right? Um, and also Janine yesterday talked about um, a comment from Smotrich around, if something along the lines of, like, if Palestinians are going to continue to exist, they have to exist as individuals,
Yeah.
right?
On
And
their
so this
land.
again,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so this again comes to what you were talking about, or also about this Zionist project to break up samud,
Mm-hmm.
to break up the fabric, right, of Palestinian social life and social
Mm-hmm.
relations, and understanding themselves
Mm-hmm.
not just as individuals, but as a people, as a as part of the same people and community.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I think that those things are related. I mean, the prison is
Yes.
specifically designed, right, to kind of individuate people in the most brutal ways that you
Yes.
can think about,
Yeah.
and
With
even when they
specific.
talk.
Yeah.
I just want to say one thing. Even when they talk about solitary confinement, they talk about the splitting of like between the self and like the psyche, basically, or
Yep.
whatever, of like this, like, so yeah. Go
Right.
ahead.
Well, with this explicit, I was going to say exactly in following what you're saying, with the explicit intent to make people more pliable, right? And more to be able to discipline them, because when you sort of deprive people of stimuli, right? Kind of like the comment of like, if you have just metal and nothing textured and nothing, which is precisely what prisons are meant to be. And then solitary confinement is also, there's a psychic purpose in that, is to disorient people away from the commitments that they might have to reality, by the way, which is why, disorienting people to time and place and all these sorts of things is actually really important. But there's the psychic impact of that. If we're talking about Palestine, it's to disorient them away from the idea of Palestine, right? And to, I mean, again, I go back to the resistance fighters who dug out of the most notorious prison, and their comments in court when they were caught, when people were like, oh, so was it worth it? Like the Zionists were sort of trying to break their spirit. And their response was like, you have no fucking idea. We got to see Palestine, right? For 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days. You cannot take that away from us. But that's the whole point, I think, of like depriving people of stimuli, is precisely towards instituting an internalization and internal infrastructure of alienation.
Yeah, thank you. I don't have anything else. Do you have anything else that you wanted to talk about or say or share with folks while you're here?
Not this time around.
Okay, we'll be
in
back.
a couple of days. We'll
sure.
be like, we need to do this again.
Yeah. It's not going to be as long. You were traveling, and yeah. So it won't be as long next time. It has definitely been a while, and people I know look forward to these lives. And that's great. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I'm always like, what am I doing? Like, why do I do this? But people do reach out, and especially around these discussions are like very, grateful for, so they get some secondhand or firsthand therapeutic aspect to it. So that's awesome. I'm glad that I know it was your idea to start this, and I think it's been helpful, and I get good feedback from folks on it. So we will continue to do it.
I appreciate you making this space as always, and also being, bringing your full self into this, and the vulnerability that's also vulnerable to be like, I've been struggling with this shit.
Sure it is, but also this is my in-kind therapy, right? So this is I don't have a therapist currently, so it's like this, I can get it, and if I wasn't honest about what I was feeling, then it wouldn't really work. So yeah, absolutely. I very much appreciate it has been, on a personal level, very helpful for me also throughout the last 10 or 11 months that we've been having these conversations. So yeah, thank you so much for that. Yeah,
thank you. Thanks, everybody.